I opened it at chapter 12 and my eye was caught by the phrase, quote, "Anybody may blame me who likes," end of quote. What were they blaming Charlotte Bronte for, I wondered. And I read how Jane Eyre used to go up onto the roof when Mrs. Fairfax was making jellies and looked over the fields at the distant view. And then she longed, and it was for this that they blamed her, that, quote, "Then I longed for a power of vision which might overpass that limit, which might reach the busy world, towns, regions full of life I had heard of but never seen. That then I desired more of practical experience than I possessed, more of intercourse with my kind, of acquaintance with variety of character than was here within my reach. I valued what was good in Mrs. Fairfax and what was good in Adele. But I believed in the existence of other and more vivid kinds of goodness, and what I believed in I wished to behold. Who blames me? Many, no doubt, and I shall be called discontented. I could not help it. The restlessness was in my nature. It agitated me to pain sometimes. It is vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. When thus alone, I not unfrequently heard Grace Poole's laugh, end of quote. That is an awkward break, I thought. It is upsetting to come upon Grace Poole all of a sudden. The continuity is disturbed. One might say, I continued, laying the book down beside Pride and Prejudice, that the woman who wrote those pages had more genius in her than Jane Austen. But if one reads them over and marks that jerk in them, that indignation, one sees that she will never get her genius expressed whole and entire. Her books will be deformed and twisted. She will write in a rage where she should write calmly. She will write foolishly where she should write wisely. She will write of herself where she should write of her character. She is at war with her lot. How could she help but die young, cramped, and thwarted? One could not but play for a moment with the thought of what might have happened if Charlotte Bronte had possessed, say, 300 a year, but the foolish woman sold the copyright of her novels outright for £1,500. Had somehow possessed more knowledge of the busy world and towns and regions full of life, more practical experience and intercourse with her kind, and acquaintance with a variety of character. In those words, she puts her finger exactly not only upon her own defects as a novelist, but upon those of her sex at that time. She knew, no one better, how enormously her genius would have profited if it had not spent itself in solitary visions over distant fields. If experience and intercourse and travel had been granted her. But they were not granted. They were withheld. And we must accept the fact that all those good novels, Villette, Emma, Wuthering Heights, Middlemarch, were written by women without more experience of life than could enter the house of a respectable clergyman. Written, too, in the common sitting room of that respectable house and by women so poor that they could not afford to buy more than a few quires of paper at a time upon which to write Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. One of them, it is true, George Eliot, escaped after much tribulation, but only to a secluded villa in St. John's Wood. And there she settled down in the shadow of the world's disapproval. Quote, "I wish it to be understood," end of quote, she wrote, quote, "that I should never invite anyone to come and see me who did not ask for the invitation," end of quote. For was she not living in sin with a married man, and might not the sight of her damage the chastity of Mrs. Smith or whoever it might be that chanced to call? One must submit to the social convention and be, quote, cut off from what is called the world, end of quote. At the same time, on the other side of Europe, there was a young man living freely with this gypsy or with that great lady, going to the wars, picking up unhindered and uncensored all that varied experience of human life which served him so splendidly later when he came to write his books. Had Tolstoy lived at the priory in seclusion with a married lady, quote, cut off from what is called the world, end of quote, however edifying the moral lesson, he could scarcely, I thought, have written War and Peace. But one could perhaps go a little deeper into the question of novel writing and the effect of sex upon the novelist if one shuts one's eyes and thinks of the novel as a whole. It would seem to be a creation owning a certain looking glass likeness to life, though of course with simplifications and distortions innumerable. At any rate, it is a structure leaving a shape on the mind's eye, built now in squares, now pagoda-shaped, now throwing out wings and arcades, now solidly compact and domed like the Cathedral of St. Sophia at Constantinople. This shape, I thought, thinking back over certain famous novels, starts in one the kind of emotion that is appropriate to it. But that emotion at once blends itself with others, for the, quote, shape, end of quote, is not made by the relation of stone to stone, but by the relation of human being to human being. Thus a novel starts in us all sorts of antagonistic and opposed emotions. Life conflicts with something that is not life. Hence the difficulty of coming to any agreement about novels and the immense sway that our private prejudices have upon us. On the one hand, we feel you, John the hero, must live, or I shall be in the depths of despair. On the other, we feel, alas, John, you must die because the shape of the book requires it. Life conflicts with something that is not life. Then since life it is in part, we judge it as life. James is the sort of man I most detest, one says. Or, this is a farrago of absurdity. I can never feel anything of the sort myself. The whole structure, it is obvious, thinking back on any famous novel, is one of infinite complexity, because it is thus made up of so many different judgments, of so many different kinds of emotion. The wonder is that any book so composed holds together for more than a year or two, or can possibly mean to the English reader what it means for the Russian or the Chinese. But they do hold together occasionally very remarkably. And what holds them together in these rare instances of survival, I was thinking of War and Peace, is something that one calls integrity, though it has nothing to do with paying one's bills or behaving honorably in an emergency. What one means by integrity in the case of the novelist is the conviction that he gives one that this is the truth. Yes, one feels, I should never have thought that this could be so. I have never known people behaving like that, but you have convinced me that so it is, so it happens. One holds every phrase, every scene to the light as one reads, for nature seems very oddly to have provided us with an inner light by which to judge of the novelist's integrity or disintegrity. Or perhaps it is rather that nature in her most irrational mood has traced in invisible ink on the walls of the mind a premonition which these great artists confirm, a sketch which only needs to be held to the fire of genius to become visible. When one so exposes it and sees it come to life, one exclaims in rapture, but this is what I have always felt and known and desired. And one boils over with excitement, and shutting the book even with a kind of reverence as if it were something very precious, a standby to return to as long as one lives, one puts it back on the shelf, I said, taking War and Peace and putting it back in its place. If, on the other hand, these poor sentences that one takes and tests rouse first a quick and eager response with their bright coloring and their dashing gestures, but there they stop, something seems to check them in their development, or if they bring to light only a faint scribble in that corner and a blot over there, and nothing appears whole and entire, then one heaves a sigh of disappointment and says, another failure. This novel has come to grief somewhere. I, for the most part, of course, I don't know where I got I from. And for the most part, of course, novels do come to grief somewhere. The imagination falters under the enormous strain. The insight is confused. It can no longer distinguish between the true and the false. It has no longer the strength to go on with the vast labor that calls at every moment for the use of so many different faculties. But how would all this be affected by the sex of the novelist, I wondered, looking at Jane Eyre and the others? Would the fact of her sex in any way interfere with the integrity of a woman novelist, that integrity which I take to be the backbone of the writer? Now, in the passages I have quoted from Jane Eyre, it is clear that anger was tampering with the integrity of Charlotte Bronte, the novelist. She left her story, to which her entire devotion was due, to attend to some personal grievance. She remembered that she had been starved of her proper due of experience. She had been made to stagnate in a parsonage mending stockings when she wanted to wander free over the world. Her imagination swerved from indignation, and we feel it swerve. But there were many more influences than anger tugging at her imagination and deflecting it from its path. Ignorance, for instance. The portrait of Rochester is drawn in the dark. We feel the influence of fear in it, just as we constantly feel an acidity which is the result of oppression, a buried suffering smoldering beneath her passion. a rancor which contracts those books, splendid as they are, with a spasm of pain. And since a novel has this correspondence to real life, its values are to some extent those of real life, but it is obvious that the values of women differ very often from the values which have been made by the other sex. Naturally, this is so, yet it is the masculine values that prevail. Speaking crudely, football and sport are, quote, important, end of quote. The worship of fashion, the buying of clothes, quote, trivial, end of quote. And these values are inevitably transferred from life to fiction. This is an important book, the critic assumes, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. A scene in a battlefield is more important than a scene in a shop. Everywhere and much more subtly, the difference of value persists. The whole structure, therefore, of the early 19th century novel was raised, if one was a woman, by a mind which was slightly pulled from the straight and made to alter its clear vision in deference to external authority. One has only to skim those old forgotten novels and listen to the tone of voice in which they are written to divine that the writer was meeting criticism. She was saying this by way of aggression or that by way of conciliation. She was admitting that she was only a woman or protesting that she was as good as a man. She met that criticism as her temperament dictated, with docility and diffidence, or with anger and emphasis. It does not matter which it was, she was thinking of something other than the thing itself. Down comes her book upon our heads. There was a flaw in the center of it, and I thought of all the women's novels that lie scattered like small pockmarked apples in an orchard about the second-hand bookshops of London. It was the flaw in the center that had rotted them. She had altered her values in deference to the opinion of others. But how impossible it must have been for them not to budge either to the right or to the left. What genius, what integrity it must have required in face of all that criticism in the midst of that purely patriarchal society to hold fast to the thing as they saw it without shrinking. Only Jane Austen did it, and Emily Bronte. It is another feather, perhaps the finest in their caps. They wrote as women write, not as men write. Of all the 1,000 women who wrote novels then, they alone entirely ignored the perpetual admonitions of the eternal pedagogue. Write this, think that. They alone were deaf to that persistent voice, now grumbling, now patronizing, now domineering, now grieved, and now shocked, and now angry, now avuncular. That voice which cannot let women alone, but must be at them, like some too conscientious governess, adjuring them, like Sir Egerton Bridges, to be refined, dragging even into the criticism of poetry, criticism of sex. This is a footnote. Quote, she has a metaphysical purpose, and that is a dangerous obsession, especially with a woman, for women rarely possess men's healthy love of rhetoric. It is a strange lack in the sex, which is in other things more primitive and more materialistic, end of quote. And that's from New Criterion, June 1928. Admonishing them if they would be good and win, as I suppose some shiny prize to keep within certain limits, which the gentleman in question thinks suitable. Quote, female novelists should only aspire to excellence by courageously acknowledging the limitations of their sex, end of quote. And then there's a footnote to that, quote, if, like the reporter, you believe that female novelists should only aspire to excellence by courageously acknowledging the limitations of their sex, Jane Austen has demonstrated how gracefully this gesture can be accomplished, end of quote. And that's from Life and Letters, August 1928. That puts the matter in a nutshell, and when I tell you, rather to your surprise, that this sentence was written not in August 1828, but in August 1928, you will agree, I think, that however delightful it is to us now, it represents a vast body of opinion. I'm not going to stir those old pools. I take only what chance has floated to my feet. That was far more rigorous and far more vocal a century ago. It would have needed a very stalwart young woman in 1828 to disregard all those snubs and chidings and promises of prizes. One must have been something of a firebrand to say to oneself, oh, but they can't buy literature too. Literature is open to everybody. I refuse to allow you, beetle though you are, to turn me off the grass. Lock up your libraries if you like, but there's no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of my mind. But whatever effect discouragement and criticism had upon their writing, and I believe that they had a very great effect, that was unimportant compared with the other difficulty which faced them. I was still considering those early 19th century novelists. When they came to set their thoughts on paper, that is, that they had no tradition behind them, or one so short and partial that it was of little help. For we think back through our mothers if we are women. It is useless to go to the great men writers for help, however much one may go to them for pleasure. Lamb, Brown, Thackeray, Newman, Sterne, Dickens, De Quincey, whoever it may be, never helped a woman yet, though she may have learnt a few tricks of them and adapted them to her use. The weight, the pace, the stride of a man's mind are too unlike her own for her to lift anything substantial from him successfully. The ape is too distant to be sedulous. Perhaps the first thing she would find setting pen to paper was that there was no common sentence ready for her to use. All the great novelists like Thackeray and Dickens and Balzac have written in natural prose, swift but not slovenly, expressive but not precious, taking their own tint without ceasing to be common property. They have based it on the sentence that was current at the time. The sentence that was current at the beginning of the 19th century ran something like this, perhaps, quote, "The grandeur of their works was an argument with them, not to stop short, but to proceed. They could have no higher excitement or satisfaction than in the exercise of their art and endless generations of truth and beauty. Success prompts to exertion, and habit facilitates success." End of quote. That is a man's sentence. Behind it, one can see Johnson, Gibbon, and the rest. It was a sentence that was unsuited for a woman's use. Charlotte Bronte, with all her splendid gift for prose, stumbled and fell with that clumsy weapon in her hands. George Eliot committed atrocities with it that beggar description. Jane Austen looked at it and laughed at it and devised a perfectly natural, shapely sentence proper for her own use and never departed from it. Thus, with less genius for writing than Charlotte Bronte, she got infinitely more said. Indeed, since freedom and fullness of expression are of the essence of the art, such a lack of tradition, such a scarcity and inadequacy of tools must have told enormously upon the writing of women. Moreover, a book is not made of sentences laid end to end, but of sentences built, if an image helps, into arcades or domes. And this shape, too, has been made by men out of their own needs for their own uses. There's no reason to think that the form of the epic or of the poetic play suits a woman any more than the sentence suits her. But all the older forms of literature were hardened and set by the time she became a writer. The novel alone was young enough to be soft in her hands, another reason perhaps why she wrote novels. Yet who shall say that even now, quote, the novel, end of quote, I give it inverted commas to mark my sense of the word's inadequacy. Who shall say that even this most pliable of all forms is rightly shaped for her use? No doubt we shall find her knocking that into shape for herself when she has the free use of her limbs and providing some new vehicle, not necessarily in verse, for the poetry in her. For it is the poetry that is still denied outlet. And I went on to ponder how a woman nowadays would write a poetic tragedy in 5 acts. Would she use verse? Would she not use prose, rather? But these are difficult questions which lie in the twilight of the future. I must leave them, if only because they stimulate me to wander from my subject into trackless forests, where I shall be lost and very likely devoured by wild beasts. I do not want, and I'm sure that you do not want me, to broach that very dismal subject, the future of fiction, so that I will only pause here one moment to draw your attention to the great part which must be played in that future so far as women are concerned by physical conditions. The book has somehow to be adapted to the body, and at a venture one would say that women's books should be shorter, more concentrated than those of men. And framed so that they do not need long hours of steady and uninterrupted work. For interruptions there will always be. Again, the nerves that feed the brain would seem to differ in men and women. And if you're going to make them work their best and hardest, you must find out what treatment suits them, whether these hours of lectures, for instance, which the monks devised presumably hundreds of years ago, suit them. what alternations of work and rest they need, interpreting rest not as doing nothing but as doing something but something that is different. And what should that difference be? All this should be discussed and discovered. All this is part of the question of women in fiction. And yet I continued approaching the bookcase again. Where shall I find that elaborate study of the psychology of women by a woman? If, through their incapacity to play football, women are not going to be allowed to practice medicine, happily, my thoughts were now given another turn.